Sure.
Second in a series, etc.
Yep. So this is the second in our series of webinars on climate smart open standards. The first one was an overview. And in this one, we're going to dive into climate scenario planning. Then we have a couple more of them planned, one on climate conceptual models and one on strategies, threat rating, and climate smart strategies. And we're recording all of these and making those recordings available to folks.
Okay. All right, then I'm going to start. Hi, everybody. My name is John Morrison. I work for WBF and CCNet. I'm talking to you from Maine, USA. And I'm going to start, even though we're talking about scenario planning today, I'm going to give a few slides from the overview presentation, and just to make sure that we're all on the same page about what this is part of. What this presentation is part of, a larger series of presentations about climate smart open standards. And this initial presentation will explain a proposal for making the applications of the open standards climate smart. I'll give you background and some overview of our changes. In terms of background, there are many people using the open standards to plan, implement, and monitor projects, but climate change is very challenging for reasons I probably don't need to elaborate on. We face resistance as conservation coaches to good planning already, because people's time and resources are already squeezed, and sometimes we're lucky to get a week with a team, even for large multi-million-dollar projects. And there are some people who believe that the open standards are already too complicated. So there's a lot of pressure on the group that I'll explain to make the climate smart changes we're suggesting to be as practical as possible and to provide options. And one of the options is to not use this somewhat more elaborate framework for incorporating climate into the open standards. It may be that you have a really short-term project, or it's a thematic project that doesn't really touch on conservation targets and really doesn't need to get into climate change. Well, it's perfectly acceptable not to use what we're suggesting. And no one would ever be forced to use this proposal. But for those people who would like to be more rigorous, who are part of a project that is a long-term commitment to a place or a species, then our suggestions may be more applicable. So the group that has put together these suggestions are these people. So Marcia, who you were just listening to, Jody Beauchavin, myself, and Sean Martin. The first three people are open standards practitioners. Sean Martin is not really an open standards practitioner, even though he has a good understanding of it. He's more of a climate adaptation person. And so he's been critical to ground truthing what we've come up with and helping to guide us. So this little working group has been developing these ideas and gathering feedback for a while, for a few years now. We presented early versions of these ideas back in 2015 at the Conservation Coaches Network Coaches Rally in Barcelona, Spain. We also had a custom workshop where we invited a number of climate people who were not open standards people to, again, give us their impressions about what really needs to be considered when you're trying to be climate smart. And that was a very important workshop. And probably what I need to add to this list is the recent Coaches Rally, CCNet Coaches Rally in Sydney, Australia, where we presented a whole series. It was a long thematic set of presentations over several days where we had a number of people. We did an overview, scenario planning, how to incorporate climate into conceptual models, how to choose climate smart strategies, etc. And again, this is just one in that series. So we looked at a number of existing guidance for incorporating climate change into the open standards. All three of these documents existed. We also looked at a number of other documents This is just a short list of them, or a short overview of some of the covers of them. And one in particular was really helpful. This one from National Wildlife Federation called Climate Smart Conservation, which we could see a little bit of open standards thinking in this document. It's got the adaptive management cycle, as you can see on the right. This is an excerpt from the document. Still, though, it seemed to us that it focused on climate adaptation and not so much taking the big picture, or okay, we need to do the best conservation for this particular place or this species. How can we be climate smart about it? It didn't have that approach. It was more focused on doing adaptation. So we felt like even though this is a fantastic document, we could still broaden the guidance enough to try to take the big picture view. Again, from this document, here's an excerpt of what they call climate smart conservation, the intentional and deliberate consideration of climate change and natural resource management, realized through adopting forward-looking goals and explicitly linking strategies to key climate impacts and vulnerabilities. Some of the overarching themes from that document were to act with intentionality, to show your work, to manage for change, not just persistence. So not get caught up in trying to save whatever species or natural communities were in your site, but realize in some cases that they're not long for your site because of the changes that are happening already or that are coming, that you need to be willing to manage for change and not just be stuck on the existing species and communities. Another theme was to reconsider your goals, not just your strategies. So be willing to modify your goals in terms of both what the conservation targets are and how much of those conservation targets you're going to try to keep in a particular place. And then to integrate adaptation into existing work. Our working group philosophy is that there's a lot of rhetoric in the climate change community about integration. You always hear about trying to integrate climate change into all planning, into conservation planning, into development planning from the beginning. That said, a lot of planning and funding is specific so that you get climate adaptation funding and climate adaptation plans, which we believe just perpetuates the lack of integration. So again, our approach is to try to see it from the big picture and really try to integrate climate change. Yeah, doing conservation in a way that considers climate change. So another part of our philosophy is that we need to understand the effects of climate change on people. We need to understand the effects of climate change on key species and ecosystems, and we need to understand the effects of people's reactions, because in some cases those reactions to climate change might be even worse than the direct impacts of climate to the ecosystems themselves. And due to the uncertainty around modeling, that using a range of climate change scenarios would help us understand how much uncertainty is out there. This slide is a slide illustrating the basic open standards that probably we all know. The first step being to summarize what it is that you want to conserve, also possibly understanding ecosystem services and human well-being. Then to understand the current and desired state of those ecosystems. How are the species and ecosystems doing today and what are our future goals? To identify and rate threats so that we understand which threats are most critical. To put that whole conservation target and threat relationships into a larger model so that we understand what the drivers and opportunities are. To use that conceptual model as a map to identify strategies. Once we've selected strategies through whatever method, that we develop detailed logic chains, results chains that show the logic of how those strategies will work. Then we implement the strategies, monitoring as we go, and make adjustments as necessary. So this is the basic steps as we've known them for many years. And just to give you an idea of how fundamentally we've thought about all of these steps and how they might need to change, being more rigorous with climate change, and you don't need to read this, but just to give you an impression about the scale and scope of our changes, this is a marked up version of that same framework, showing how much thinking we put into the whole process. So I'll give you a cleaner version of this. The first step would be to define the scope of the project and conservation targets, as well as ecosystem services and human well-being if necessary, to understand the current state of ecosystems, but not yet think about future goals until we have a better understanding of what the climate impacts are. To identify conventional threats, add those to our model, to develop a minimum of 2 climate scenarios for the site and to use those to identify what the changes are. And that includes the ecological changes, the human impacts, and the human reaction impacts, which we think consists of or comprises a vulnerability assessment. Once we've done that, a very specific vulnerability assessment for our site. Then to combine the conventional threats and the climate impacts into 1 or more conceptual models, to rate the threats and the climate impacts using slightly different rating system, which we explained in the overview, to revisit, to take a pause and revisit the ecosystems and species and understand the achievable states for those ecosystems and species, including maybe deciding that, well, a different set of targets, ecosystems and species, might be more realistic and that we might want to start to let go of particular ecosystems and species. Not that I've ever seen this happen, but the step 7 is all about taking a step back and taking the broader perspective and say, okay, is it really reasonable to try to maintain all of these species and ecosystems in this particular place, for example? Then to identify climate smart or non-maladaptive strategies based on our conceptual model, and to develop results chains that show how the strategies will work, even in the face of climate change. So the suggestion there is to actually leave some of the climate impacts in our results chains so that we can say, we believe that this strategy is going to work, and this is how we think it's going to work, even with these climate impacts occurring. And then to implement the strategies, monitoring both the strategies themselves as well as climate, because it's often the case that we don't have enough information about how the climate is changing in the specific place, and then make adjustments. So this is the overall scheme as we presented it a couple weeks ago in the overview presentation that we did a couple times. So questions about how we should roll this out. So if you have ideas about how we should roll this whole process out, we'd love to hear about it. And if you'd like to provide feedback, we'd be happy to receive your emails, Marcia and myself. And so here's my email and Marcia's email. And if you have thoughts during this presentation or afterwards, we'd love to hear your thoughts. All right, so I'm going to transition out of this presentation and go to the main presentation about scenario planning. While I do that, does anyone have any questions? All right, and I'm going to keep going. So again, this is the presentation that focuses on scenario planning. I've just given you a really brief overview of the whole process, and we're focusing on that step 4 about scenario planning. So we'll talk about scenario planning, how to do it, and Marcia will talk about an example from San Francisco Bay. So there are a number of sources of uncertainty about climate change. Here's just one graphic illustrating what the potential future could look like in terms of how much greenhouse gas could be in our atmosphere. Note that we're somewhere down here, and we just don't know. Is the best case scenario going to happen and we're going to be somewhere here, or are things going to get a lot worse? And no one can say what the future will bring. So there's that uncertainty about the trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions. There's uncertainty about the level and direction of the climate exposure factor. So for example, will the temperature get a bit warmer, or is it going to get really hot in a particular place? Will the precipitation increase or decrease? In some places, it's known that, it looks like the precipitation will increase or decrease. In other parts of the world, and it's not uncommon, it's not even clear whether precipitation will go up or down. So uncertainty about how much greenhouse gas will be in the atmosphere, and then uncertainty about how the climate will actually react to that. There's uncertainty because of randomness, of stochasticity, like when and where will extreme storms occur. There's uncertainty about the response of ecosystems and species to all of these changes above. There's uncertainty in terms of what people will do. So how will people react to the impacts that they feel? There's uncertainty about the effectiveness of our policies and management actions. So all of this uncertainty is piled on top of each other, and it makes for a very unstable system in which to plan our future. So potential responses are to focus on the better understood parts of the problem, or we could wait for more certainty before taking action. We could wait 20 or 30 years, make sure we understand what directions things are going to go, and then start to act. We could pretend as if there is no uncertainty, or we think it's more important or more appropriate to understand the uncertainty and try to work with it. And so that's what this scenario planning is all about. So scenario planning is, this is a quote, one decision support method that can help address uncertainties in natural resource management, including those associated with climate change. It has a long history of use in the military and in business. It's particularly applicable to situations with high uncertainty, as we just discussed, a lot of complexity and impact, and low controllability. In other words, once those greenhouse gases are out there, we can't do anything about it. It's a tool for thinking broadly and imagining a future that could be very different from the past or the present. So scenarios can be stories or hypotheses that describe plausible future situations. They're not predictions or projections or models. There's ideas about what the future might be like. It is a combination of science and art. So the best science, hopefully, and the art of trying to imagine what the future's going to be like, since no one can say for certain what that future will be. Just to help illustrate that, here's a couple different themes. So in temperature, here are 4 different global circulation models. This is obviously a map of the United States, and this is what 4 different circulation models are telling us the temperature might be in the future. So same time horizon, and you can see that the temperature could be very different depending on which model you think is correct. Similarly, for precipitation, you can see the differences between these different models. These are very different futures to try to imagine. And again, no one knows what's actually going to happen. No one knows which of these models is more accurate. No one knows how much emissions will be out there, etc. So why would we do scenario planning? Because we need to consider multiple future situations and ask questions like, how much will climate affect our conservation targets? Which of our species and ecosystems are most vulnerable? How will species ranges shift? How will those species adapt? How will the ecosystem composition change as individual species move independently, latitudinally and altitudinally? This is a one quadrant thing. I'm going to show you 2 different quadrant graphics, and this is the first one. So on this axis, we've got level of control, and we are in a low level of control situation with climate change. And here on the bottom axis is level of uncertainty, and we're in a high uncertainty situation. So this is exactly the place we find ourselves, and we're scenario planning for situations with high uncertainty and low controllability. This is where we're at with climate change. It's the worst possible situation to be in, but it's where we find ourselves, and so we have to address it. The ideal place would be up here, where we've got a high level of control and a low level of uncertainty. This would be the optimal planning. We could control our future best, but we're here, and so scenario planning is the right tool to use in this kind of a situation. This is a totally different quadrant, and this is the kind of thing that we'd like to build. So we could have a couple variables like more versus less precipitation, gradual warming versus extreme heat waves. And here we've got 4 different scenarios. I'm going to keep going, but show you how we would build something like this. So we could relatively quickly develop a bunch of scenarios to consider, okay? So there are a number of ways to do scenario planning. There's the nested quadrants way, where you've got 2 variables. There's a variable here, societal concern, another variable here, and then you've got 2 more variables, and it's multiplied. So this is the nested quadrants variables. So we've got 16 scenarios here. It's very complicated. We could do change scenarios where you have two variables, but 2 different time periods. There are a couple of other methods that I've got in the presentation, which is posted. I'm not going to dwell on these. This is the one that we're recommending, and it's the most common approach, where you've got these basic quadrants using 2 variables that creates 4 scenarios. And I'm going to talk about how we would develop this. So I just talked about what scenario planning was. Now I'll talk about how to do it. So the steps would be that we're recommending would be to develop a local seasonal calendar for your project scope with stakeholders. That's the first step. Then use some different representative concentration pathways or basically different emission scenarios and global circulation models to identify important variables with high uncertainty. Then to select 2 of those variables, 2 important variables that have high uncertainty, name and describe the scenarios, select 1 or 2 scenarios to document in a conceptual model, and then describe the ecological, socioeconomic impacts plus the human reaction impacts. And that's, again, what we consider the specific vulnerability assessment. And we'll come back to this during the scenarios during strategy selection, because we can use the scenarios and ask ourselves the question, just like we ask ourselves the question about strategies: how much are they going to cost? What we think the likelihood of success are? How complicated are they? How technically feasible are they? Here's another question. We can put our strategies through the scenarios and say, okay, will our strategies, the strategies that we've come up with, will they work in all of the scenarios that we're considering? And if they don't work in a particular scenario, then that's a red flag, and you might want to reconsider that particular strategy. On the other hand, if all of your strategies work in all of the scenarios you're considering, then that can give you some degree of confidence that they're going to be okay no matter which direction the climate goes. So there's the overview of developing a scenario, and I'll dive into it. So the first step I mentioned was to develop a local seasonal calendar. So this is just a relatively simple tool that you can use with a small group, with a larger group, to try to get your head or the team's head around the climate, the weather and climate in a particular place. So you can see that the months are written on a piece of tape on the wall through the year. And all of these yellow post-its up on top are actually how the climate changes across the year as the months change. So it basically spells out the seasonality of a particular place. That's what's up here. The green post-its down here are the ecological things that are happening. So phenological things like leaf out or flowering of trees, of breeding seasons, of migrants arriving, all sorts of things. Anything that's related to or can be spelled out, here are the ecological changes that occur during the year, and especially you can start to see how they're tied to weather and climate. Down here in the pink are outdoor livelihoods, outdoor activities that people engage in and how those change across the year. And then you can see a few orange post-its, and those are cultural events, festivals, etc., that happen during the year. So an exercise like this doesn't have to take a long time. Maybe it takes 45 minutes, an hour. It could obviously take longer, but it's a quick way to get your head around how climate changes across any given year. What are the weather patterns? What are the seasonal weather patterns in any particular place? So just a suggestion for trying to familiarize yourself with the local climate. So number 2, this is a more complicated step, using different representative concentration pathways, which just take this to mean different greenhouse gas emissions scenarios and global circulation models, climate models, to identify important variables. So one approach that you could use, there are a number of ways to approach this, but one approach is to select a particular RCP or emission scenario, run a large suite. It could be 10, 20, 30 global circulation models, and depends how much assistance you have. And I'll give you some hints about how you could do this yourself. Run a number of global circulation models, climate models. Look for those variables in the outputs where the models all agree. So that's giving you some confidence that, okay, the temperature is definitely going to get warmer, and it's going to go in this direction, and it's going to be of this relative magnitude, or all the models agree that precipitation is going to decrease by a certain amount within ranges. So understand where the models agree, and also understand where the models disagree. So look for those variables, especially those important variables in a particular place because of the ecology or because of people's livelihoods. Look for the variables where the models are different. Where there are those differences, look at those variables and choose 2 of them. And I'll talk about what those variables can be. And these variables become the scenario axes in our quadrant model. And just to note that 2 axes is a lot, and any more it gets really, really complicated very quickly. So it just creates a lot of work for you that you may not be up for. So these just an illustration of the different RCPs, the different emissions scenarios. This is the most aggressive one, and this is the best case scenario in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but it may not be very likely. It's probable that we're going to be up somewhere up here, at least on our current path. So here I'll take a little bit of a timeout just to explain that there is a tool out there to use. Now you could have someone on your staff in your organization. You could work with a government agency. There might be a university student, a meteorology student who could help you, a climate change specialist, or you could hire a consultant to do this modeling, or there's this Climate Wizard tool that's free and available to you. And so I'm going to back out of my presentation, and I'm going to go to this Climate Wizard tool here. I could look at the World Cup, but I'm taping the games. I don't really want to know what the answers are. So, so here's what this Climate Wizard tool looks like. There's a little map. You could make a polygon of the area of your interest and say, okay, this is the area that I'm really interested in. You can give it a name. There's my polygon. And sorry, make that bigger again. If we scroll down here, here are all the inputs. So we can say, all right, it's this predefined area. You could put a particular country or by region. You can have the option of specifying a time period. So you could say, all right, mid-century versus the end of the century. You could say, I would like just to know the annual outputs or the annual precipitation, et cetera. We'll look at the variables next, or more likely monthly. That pop-up just said that there are some variables that we can't get monthly data for. And you can just go through here and tick all of the temperature variables that you'd be interested in hearing about, all of the precipitation variables, all the aridity variables, and you can see what the options are. And here in this box are the various global circulation models that are part of the program. So you could go ahead, click the top one, click the bottom one, and say, I want to run all of these models all at once, look at the outputs, and look for the variability. Okay, and you can specify a high emission scenario, a medium emission scenario. You give your output a name and your email address, you submit it, and you'll get an email with a link. You go to that link and it'll bring you back to the same website, and all your outputs will be there. And your outputs will be mapped in pixels. You can also download tables with all of the outputs by month, etc. And I am going to go here and just give you an idea of what the outputs looks like. Obviously, so here's the area. So this is an example, southern Namibia, variables like percent of time maximum temperature exceeds the top annual 10%, or total precipitation, or number of wet days. These are just a few variables that I ran, and here's all the outputs. Here are the months through the year, so January, February, March, April, etc. Here is the minimum of all of those models, because I ran all the models. I think I need to move this out of the way just a little bit, but it won't be easy. And the top of all of those models is over here somewhere, and here's the 50th percentile. Okay, so if I go say January, I want to know the total precipitation in January for southern Namibia. The middle, the 50th percentile, the average was, it's going to go down -6 millimeters, okay? Up near the 95th, it will go, some of the model near the 95th percentile is saying precipitation will increase by 23 millimeters, and the 5th percentile model is saying it's going to go down by 14 millimeters. So this just, it shows you the array and the amount of variability between all of the models. Now, in another spreadsheet, it would tell you exactly which model gave you which value, but that doesn't really matter to us. What's important is to look at the variability and say, okay, up near the top, some models are saying there's going to be more precipitation. Other models are saying there's going to be less precipitation. This is clearly a variable that has a high amount of uncertainty associated with it for total precipitation. And depending on which month was going to be important in southern Namibia, maybe they're all important, but it could be that there's a couple really critical months where ecological activities are happening or human livelihood activities are happening. You can start to say, okay, here are the variables that have a lot of uncertainty. Okay, so that was just a quick aside about this Climate Wizard tool.
So John, before you go on, let's just mention one other thing, which is that when you have the data in Excel, it's really helpful to use the function that Excel has that allows you to color code it, because that allows you to just visually detect where there is more variability. And, you know, just looking at those colors, you could see if you go up a little bit, John, you know, that there's a lot of variability in those first few months of January, February, March. Like just the colors sort of point that out to you, from the yellow to the darker green.
Yeah, so this coloring, if you come with this coloring, I'll show you, it's really easy to do this actually. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look, okay, here's December. Here I'm going to go to December, and I'm going to grab this whole thing up to January for number of wet days. I'm going to go to conditional formatting. You get these color scales, and you could choose whatever color scale seems to make the most sense to you. Here's just a different color scale, and click on that, and it automatically helps you visualize the upper ends in terms of, for example, this variable, number of wet days. So this says, okay, there's going to be 2.8 more wet days for some of the models are saying, than less wet days other models. So that's what Marcia was talking about, this quick tool that's part of Excel that you may or may not have used to help you visualize the outputs of Climate Wizard. Thanks for pointing that out, Marcia. Okay, so back to our presentation. Again, so that the point of that was just to say, remember what we're trying to do. We're trying to figure out which climate variables have the most uncertainty, the most variability associated with them based on what the models say. And you could hire someone to do it, or get some help from any of these places, or you can literally do it yourself using this free tool, Climate Wizard. And maybe I might go back just for 1 second so you can see what the URL is. So it's climatewizard.ciat.cgiar.org. And if you Google it, you'll find the tool. And it's freely available, and you can do it yourself. Now, of course, you can get some advice to help you interpret the results also, but you could at least play around with it and get an idea of how much variability is with some important climate variables. Okay, so maybe I'll go back to just so it's clear where we're at. So we talked about the local seasonal calendar. We just talked about using different emissions scenarios and circulation models to identify important variables with high uncertainty. Next, we want to select 2 or more variables with high uncertainty. I wouldn't recommend going any higher than 2, but you're perfectly able to do so if you want to. So let me keep going. So that was the local calendar. Now we just talked about using the emission scenarios and the models, Climate Wizard. Now we want to select 2 of the variables. So here are some examples of the variables that often have uncertainty, that are often important. And I bolded 2 of them. Temperature, for example, whether it's going to be a gradual or an extreme increase, Precipitation is usually important in most of the places we work. Is it less? Is it more? But there are other variables like sea level rise, ocean acidification, snow cover, how long it will last, extreme events in terms of temperature or precipitation events, extreme storms, the frequency and magnitude, I keep meaning to change that, magnitude of drought, and you could include socioeconomic variables as well. You could consider whether or not the government's going to change, whether or not the government will implement a green economy approach versus business as usual. You don't have to be restricted to these climate variables. You could use other variables if that was really what was most appropriate in your situation. And again, I bolded temperature and precipitation because they're the most common variables and they commonly have some uncertainty associated with them, but it all depends on what the model outputs tell you and what's most of interest in your particular site. So the next step is to name and describe the scenarios. So say we choose two variables, one being one is precipitation, and some of the models are saying there's going to be less, some of the models are saying it's going to be more, some of the models say that warming is going to be quite gradual, other models are saying it's going to come in extreme heat waves in the very near future. Those are the two variables that we're talking about. Now we'll just say, okay, up in this quadrant, it's going to be much hotter based on this axis and drier because there's less precipitation. We'll call that the dry roasted scenario. And the idea here is just to give them funny names so that it's easier to remember your scenarios rather than just saying 1 and 2, 3, or 4. That's boring. So let's give them some funny names. So slight warming and drier is Hotel California. Much hotter and wetter is a wet, hot mess. And slight warming and wetter is Tropicana. That's just a practice, a common practice to give them funny names. So here's another example. The variable is whether or not the summer monsoon precipitation in that kind of climate situation will increase in one case, or there'll be a slight decrease to no change on the other end. And in terms of the summer temperature increase, it would be a little bit warmer here, but really warm here. And so you can see that in this situation, they gave the names of Jurassic Park and Flaming Hot, a bit warm, and Snowpocalypse, because it's believed in this situation that there would be quite a bit more snow. But I hope you get the idea. Just two variables, summer temperature increase and summer monsoon precipitation, creates 4 scenarios, and each scenario gets a name. So, and here are the kinds of impacts we're looking for. So here we've got temperature and precipitation variability, flooding and extreme heat. That's the actual climate changes in this particular scenario up here. Here in this scenario, in this quadrant, we've got temperature and precipitation variability, flooding and more snow. And then the last scenario, we've got temperature and precipitation variability, drought and flooding. So notice the last two of these changes is different for each quadrant, for each scenario, but across all of the scenarios, we believe that there will be temperature and precipitation variability. So even though that there is a deterministic direction, in all of the scenarios, we're anticipating a lot of variability and probably changes in seasons that we can't quite understand. So again, back to our example. We recommend that you take 2 of these scenarios. You could work with all 4, no reason you couldn't, except that it's just a lot of work, but a minimum of 2 is what we recommend. If you tried to do it for all 4, that's a lot of work. I've done it, and if you have enough people to help you figure out what the impacts are, all more power to you. It's just a fair amount of work. So options for selecting which scenario you would work with. One way to approach this is to have one least change scenario and then some other different scenario. Different for whatever reason, different because it's more extreme or different because you've never imagined that particular scenario. You could also select scenarios that would have the greatest impact on your conservation targets for whatever reasons. Or you could just simply select 2 scenarios that are very different. There's lots of different logics that you could use to select the scenarios that you work with. The next step would be to actually start to figure out, okay, what are the ecological changes? What are the impacts on people? How are people going to react? And a tool we often suggest is something we call an ecological drawing. This is an example of an ecological drawing where clearly you've got a mountain area and you've got montane forests here. You've got some riparian vegetation. You've got the river itself. There are some wildlife species in here. There are some plant communities, etc. You've also got people out on the landscape. So they're farming, they're hunting, they're out with their yurts and gears, with their livestock, etc. So we've got the ecological targets, the conservation targets on our diagram. Then we add people and people's activities there. And then we take for each scenario, so say you've got 4 scenarios, you do one of these drawings for each scenario. And it's a great group task to have the group draw the targets and people out on the landscape, and then to think about what are the impacts expected from the changes related to that particular scenario. So again, it's a really simple tool that you can use to have people start to familiarize themselves with what the changes will mean for ecosystems, species, people. What are people likely to do, and how will that in turn affect the ecosystems and species? And you can capture that on some sort of a data sheet. I mean, this is just a real rough one, but we have data sheets that we've developed for understanding the impacts on the ecosystems and species, how people will be affected, and how will people react, and what are the indirect impacts on ecosystems from people's reactions. So for example, there's going to be more droughts, so people are going to build dams. In turn, that's going to affect freshwater ecosystems even more than they might have been impacted directly by climate. So I think I need to fill this in. So here are, just to give you a sense of what this would look like, here are the 4 scenarios we've been using, and here are the kinds of impacts we'd be capturing for each scenario. So in this particular scenario, the wet hot mess, we'd have increased soil erosion, new diseases and pests, increased agricultural runoff. For the slight warming and wetter situation, we'd have better agricultural yields, grasslands becoming forests, and increased human population. Versus this quadrant where it's much hotter and drier, we have frequent forest fires, rivers becoming ephemeral, meaning they're only running certain times of the year, and decreased human population. So these two are very different scenarios. People are leaving the area in this scenario, and people are coming into the area because it's much nicer for people in this particular scenario. And this is just a real shorthand capture of the kinds of impacts. More realistically, it would look something like this, where there's lots of impacts, both the ecological impacts, the human impacts, and how people are likely to react. So don't expect that your results will always look nice and neat like this. It's probably going to be a little bit messier and look something like this. All right, so that is that's my introduction about how to conduct scenario planning. I might go back to my slide that has the whole process in it, and stop there and ask people if you have questions. Completely overwhelming?
Yeah, this
John,
stuff is a lot to absorb, we know. Go ahead.
John, this is Doug. Just
Hey,
a
Doug.
quick question. How did you select that particular climate wizard? There are other options, right?
When you say that particular climate wizard, you mean that particular tool?
Yeah, there are other online climate wizard tools.
We don't know about them.
Ah,
If there are, again, we don't know about them. This is the one that we found, and then Sean Martin, he had a group of university students look for tools, and this was the only comparable thing that they could find. But
and I can't comment
know about.
really. I can't comment on any of them. I just did a Google for a climate wizard, and there are at least 5 options that come up. One by the U.S. Forest Service. Yeah, I won't go through them, but okay.
Yeah.
So you're not sure.
I can't comment, Doug. We're not aware of them. That has the option of having so many different models to run at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I think we also were looking for something that would be global. You know, I think there may be some programs that are, you know, more U.S. focused.
That's also true. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions?
And we will share that link. We can email that around just to make sure everybody caught that. The link for the Climate Wizard.
All right, and I'm going to move forward. And Marcia's going to talk about the San Francisco Bay example. And I'll if you give me a hint.
Okay, will do. Okay, so starting what at this point is probably a couple of years ago, FOS had the chance to work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on a planning process for a complex of refuges. So you can see there are 7 national wildlife refuges in this complex, and they wanted to undertake a planning process that would incorporate looking at climate for this whole suite of national wildlife refuges. So done. We can go to the next one. So they started by defining their conservation targets the same way you would, you know, start any open standards process. And so those included some sand dunes, some vernal pools, grasslands, some watersheds, coastal sand dunes, you know, as well as the riverine ones, tidal marsh water birds, estuarine island ecosystems, and marine island ecosystems. We're going to zoom in on the tidal marsh just as an example, because these guys were very detail oriented. So a lot of what they did was target by target. So I'm going to show you a bit of what they did, but focusing on the tidal marsh. So the next step in the open standards process is to do your viability assessment, and they did that. And here I'm just showing you just a snapshot of that. And so for the tidal marsh, one of the categories is the size of the tidal marsh. One of the key ecological attributes is the extent of high quality tidal marsh. And so they looked at, you know, how many hectares of high quality tidal marsh would be considered poor, fair, good, and very good. And they rated what the current status is. We recommend not rating the future status until you have gone through the process of climate scenario planning and, you know, other steps of, you know, doing your conceptual model, doing your threat rating, to really analyze the climate factors. Okay, so we can go on to the next slide. So they used this same general approach. John, why don't you just make all of the numbers appear? The one thing that was different that I think would be valuable to do probably in any process is that they also did a pretty extensive review of literature to look at what the literature was saying about the projections of the potential effects of climate on their conservation targets. But they started by looking at a bunch of different global circulation models to identify important variables. They selected at least 2 variables. They weren't very creative in naming their climate scenarios, as you'll see when I get into this. Not as creative as John has been with his group, but they did describe the ecological and socioeconomic impacts of the different scenarios in a slightly different way than we've shown before. But they followed the same basic process. Then and we're not really in this presentation talking a lot about conceptual models, but we have talked a bit about what do you do when you have 4 different scenarios? How do you incorporate that into, you know, ideally not 4 conceptual models? What they decided to do was to incorporate the most extreme impacts of the scenarios in their conceptual model, which were target specific. Yeah, we can keep going, John. So, and actually click a couple more times for this one. So they chose to use that 8.5 representative concentration pathway, which is the most pessimistic. And I would just say generally that people are tending to use either 8.5 or 6.0. I think people are moving away from using the more optimistic scenarios right now, just based on the fact that we're not taking action as quickly as we should for climate change. Okay, we can keep going. They use downscaled climate projections for precipitation and temperature from something called the Terrestrial Biodiversity Climate Change Collaborative, and that had some specific data that was specific to the San Francisco Bay area. Of course, when you have something that is more specific to your site, fabulous, because I think that the Climate Wizard, the scale at which it is making its projections can be kind of large compared to, you know, if you can get something that's more specific to your site and smaller scale, then that's better. We can keep going to the next slide. So they looked at temperature and precipitation for the whole complex, but then they also zoomed in on specifically the San Pablo Bay area of the San Francisco Bay complex and looked at projections for sea level rise and the impact that could have on tidal marsh. And this map is a little bit difficult to interpret, so let me work on interpreting it for you. So the gray area, like on the right where you see that it says Napa River, that's where there's currently water, and then in the bottom where it says San Pablo Bay, that's where there's currently water. So where you see the blue is if sea level rises by 200 centimeters, that is the area that will be inundated. And the area where you see the red outline, that's land that is owned and managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as part of the San Pablo Bay refuge. So you can see that that refuge is going to be, based on their current land holdings, completely inundated under this projection of 200 centimeters of sea level rise. So sea level rise is a very, very significant factor for these guys. We can keep going. So for their scenario planning, they definitely wanted to look at sea level rise. Now, because tidal marsh is a very important conservation target for them in this area, they also chose to look at sedimentation because they currently have different forms of the tidal marsh, and we'll see that in the next few graphics. You know, there's low marsh, there's medium marsh, there's high marsh, and sedimentation affects the amount of the different types of marsh that you have. And as sea level rises, if you want the marsh to move inland, it needs some sedimentation to be able to move. And the rate of sedimentation is influenced by things like if there are dams upstream, which would reduce your sedimentation rate, if there are extreme storms, which could bring a whole bunch of sediment in a short period of time, or if there are structures to trap sediment, you know, those are some of the factors that affect the sedimentation rate. So they were looking at these scenarios of, you know, low sea level rise versus high sea level rise, low sedimentation versus high sedimentation. So we can go to the next slide. So as I said before, they were not terribly creative with their titles. Low sea level rise, high sedimentation, high sea level rise, high sedimentation, low sea level rise, low sedimentation, low sea level rise, high sea level rise, low sedimentation. And we can keep going. So as I mentioned before, they reviewed and summarized a whole bunch of literature on the potential impacts of certain climate factors on their conservation targets. So they had a couple of big spreadsheets, and this was the spreadsheet that was organized by article, but also organized according to the conservation target and according to the climate factor, with descriptions of how this climate factor would affect this specific conservation target. And if we go to the next slide, once they had listed out all the literature, then they organized it, they summarized it for each target. They summarized how each climate exposure factor, such as sea level rise and the stresses that it's causing, would affect that conservation target. So we can keep going. So now this is how they presented, rather than using those 4 quadrants that John was showing, even though I put their information, into the 4 quadrants, or I showed the 4 quadrants on the previous slide, they didn't really present their information in that way. But they have a bunch of graphics for specific parts of the San Pablo Bay, in which they show how much of the different types of tidal marsh they would have based on, under these 4 different scenarios. And so to read these, if you look at the first column of each one of the 4, it's the same. So you're starting out in 2010 with, probably about 40% of the area is mid-marsh. Probably, roughly 40% or so is mudflats, maybe, 15, 16% or so is your low marsh. Then you've got a tiny amount of high marsh, maybe 2%, 3%. And then you've got a little bit of what they call uplands, which is the land that is inland of the tidal marsh. And then they, looked over the next few decades at how that would change under these different scenarios. And you can see with the one to the left, you would have almost immediate transition to entirely mid-marsh, whereas, under that low sea level rise, high sedimentation combination. Whereas with low sea level rise, low sedimentation, you still would transition to mid-marsh, but it would entail sort of a more gradual loss of the low marsh and more gradual loss of the mud flat. So I won't go into all 4, but that's just how you interpret those graphics. We can go to the next slide. They also looked, and some of this data really surprised me, but they looked at how these different scenarios would affect different bird species, and found that actually there weren't going to be, really severe impacts on these specific species. So we can keep going. So now taking their information and putting it into these 4 quadrants, which I did, they didn't present it in this manner. You can see the top left quadrant, which is the low sea level rise. Can you hit next once, John, just so we get the other? Okay. So low sea level rise with high sedimentation is in many ways for some of the species that so in many ways it's sort of the least change scenario. It's low sea level rise, not high sea level rise, and they do have a bunch of sediments coming in to help the tidal marsh to move. You do get, loss of mudflats and low marsh and a decline in the high marsh. You get almost all mid marsh. But in some ways this is a better scenario than some of the other ones for some of the species that they're looking at. Let's look at that bottom right quadrant where you've got low sedimentation and high sea level rise, which in many ways is like your worst case scenario, the like most change scenario as opposed to the least change scenario. So they're managing for some species that need to be able to find cover, and some of those are endangered or threatened species. So there's the Ridgway's rail. There's also a species called the salt marsh harvest mouse, which is, if it is out in open areas, it can suffer predation by birds. So it needs to be able to hide in the marsh vegetation. So this scenario would be the worst scenario for some of those species and would likely cause a decline in the Ridgway's rail and other marsh birds, and as well as the salt marsh harvest mouse. So we can go on to the next slide. So I think this is my last slide, and the other thing I wanted to point out is that they summarized each one of the climate scenarios. This is actually a summary for the whole complex, so it's not looking so specifically at the tidal marsh in San Pablo Bay. It's looking at temperature and precipitation for the whole complex. But they had these nice, relatively brief write-ups to summarize each one of their climate scenarios. So you can keep going, but I think, and across all of the scenarios, sea level rise was something that was consistently going to increase. So when they did an analysis for the whole complex, they focused more on temperature and precipitation, and had sea level rise as more of like a constant variable that would change under all the scenarios. So I think that's it for that San Francisco example.
That is it.
Questions? And we'd be really interested to know if any of you have used climate scenario analyses, or if any of you are interested in doing that, and generally what your plans are for using climate smart open standards.
And if anyone is motivated, if any of this seems interesting enough and you have a situation where you could apply it and you'd like some help, Marsh and I would be happy to provide advice and assistance.
And it would be very helpful for us.
Exactly.
Because we consider these climate smart open standards to be like the initial draft, but they still need a lot of testing in the field.
And we'd love feedback in terms of, wow, that's asking a lot, or yep, it seems pretty reasonable. And again, one of the options is we're not suggesting that this is appropriate for every project. It's really appropriate for those large projects or projects where you're going to be committed to a particular place for the long term, where you really need to consider climate. But if you've got a one-year project, you could make a case for not going through all of this extra effort.
So thoughts, comments? Please take yourselves off of mute.
Hi, this is Charles from the Nature Conservancy of Canada. My feeling is that the approach that you have developed seems like it is as simple as it can get, considering the amount of variability that we have to deal with. So, good job.
That's encouraging. Thanks, Charles.
I noticed several of your colleagues are on with us or have been on with us. So it's good to see a good group of Canadians on the webinar.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of interest in this topic here at NCC, and I'll make sure that if I hear from staff that want to tackle or do a a pilot using this method, I'll send you an email.
Yeah, definitely let us know.
This is Doug. I would like to second Charles's point about this appearing to be fairly simple and logical. Thank you for that. I had a question about the decision. I think, Marcia, you were saying that many projects, at least so far, are opting for the higher concentration scenarios. You may have mentioned, I didn't catch it if you did, how is the likelihood of each of those scenarios taken into consideration? And I don't know if they're all considered more or less equally likely.
That's a good question. I think that based on the changes that we're already seeing and how rapidly we're seeing changes, and how the projections of like melting at the poles is happening much faster than scientists had projected. I think that that's influencing people's tendency to go towards the more extreme RCPs.
And note that you could do it a couple of times. You could do the more extreme and a less extreme.
Mm-hmm.
The extreme version, of course, is the toughest test for your strategies. That's, it's asking the question, okay, if it really gets bad, will our strategies still be robust in the face of those changes?
Yeah, I think that probably holds for many things, but the outcomes for the coastal marsh, the interaction between sea level rise and sedimentation, take different pathways with respect to outcomes for the marsh. It's not linear, for example.
True.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I would agree. Exploring different scenarios is probably the best option.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one thing we haven't talked about a lot, but we have seen examples where people will look at one biophysical factor and combine it with a socioeconomic factor. Look at change in precipitation and combine it with political will to make the changes that need to be made. Political will to conserve biodiversity and invest in our high biodiversity areas. And, so your two factors don't have to be both biophysical factors.
All right, I guess if there aren't any more comments or questions, and of course we're doing this again at 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. So if you want another crack at it, understanding it,